What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. The 12 most influential royal slayings in world history. History is chock full of bloody moments. Of those bloody moments, assassinations are some of the most grimly fascinating, since they are usually the result of complicated plots, schemes, and conspiracies. Often, these events are historically important, as well, since assassinations that changed the world brought about chaos, fear, and change sometimes on a global scale. Executions have also played a significant role in altering the course of history. Royals have been the victims of more than a few bloody ends. True part of ruling is dying. After all, death is part of the royal life cycle. But many royals throughout history were ushered into death a little faster and less naturally than others. Since royals are living and breathing symbols of power and authority, one of the most significant and cold-blooded ways to challenge that power and authority is to straight-up kill them. Royal assassinations are always political. To assume power, it's sometimes necessary to get one's hands dirty and murder a royal. Since royals hold positions of massive importance locally and globally, their slayings are often political bombshells that have a multitude of repercussions. Some changed the course of history, ushered in periods of war, new regimes, and resistance movements. Others had no effect but to keep vulnerable societies on edge. Either way, they're as fascinating to discover as they are historically significant. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria sparked World War I. Perhaps the most consequential royal assassination in modern history was the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The empire by 1914 was nothing more than a patchwork of various ethnic and national groups joined together. Bosnia, with the city of Sarajevo, had been annexed by the empire in 1908, much to the fury of neighboring Serbia. So, when Franz Ferdinand visited Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, the air was rife with tension. While traveling in an open-air motorcar with his wife Sophie, the Archduke's car was approached by a Slav nationalist who pulled out a pistol and shot the royal couple to death. The start of World War I was the murder of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie by Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old. In retaliation for the death of its heir, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. This declaration of war ultimately pulled Germany, Russia, France, and Great Britain into war as well, thanks to their complicated networks of alliances. And the rest, as they say, is history. Alexander the Liberator was bombed by anarchists in the middle of St. Petersburg. Alexander II of Russia was known as a reformer. In 1861, the same year America fell into civil war over the question of slavery, Alexander emancipated the serfs, Russia's medieval form of unfree labor. He also worked to reform the Russian judicial system. But the reforms of Alexander the Liberator weren't enough for a divided Russia. He could also be repressive and suspicious of political movements. On March 13, 1881, the 62-year-old emperor was traveling in his carriage in St. Petersburg when anarchists threw bombs at him. Alexander died an hour later. Alexander II's successors learned a lesson from the assassination. Be firm, be conservative, and don't trust the people. This lesson would shape the final decades of the Romanov imperial dynasty, ultimately alienating the Russian people and leading to revolution. King Charles I was beheaded after he pissed off Parliament. The most well-known political murder in Europe was King Charles I's execution during the English Civil Wars, before the guillotine famously cut off the heads of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution. Throughout the course of his nearly 24-year reign, Charles routinely butted heads with an increasingly restless and powerful parliament. Tensions broke out into open rebellion. King and Cavalier fought against parliamentarian and Roundhead throughout the 1640s. After Parliament's victories on the battlefield, it became clear that Charles was not going to be good at sharing power. So, the English Parliament went out of its way to legally and politically justify killing a king. And they were successful in their endeavor. Charles was beheaded on January 30, 1649. The democratic repercussions of Charles's murder cannot be exaggerated. It was a significant step in a representational parliament checking the power of a European monarch. Some doubted Tobin Shweti's strength because of his alcoholism. One of the most significant rulers in Southeast Asian history is Tabin Shwedi, king of Burma during the 16th century. Though he orchestrated the expansion of the Burmese kingdom and founded the Taungoo Empire, he also loved wine. Competitors saw an opportunity when he quickly became an alcoholic. In their opinion, Tabin Shwedi was not so great after all, and was a weak man. As a result, the 34-year-old warrior king was killed in his sleep in 1550. Historian Victor Lieberman characterized Tabin Shwedi's death as one of the great turning points of mainland history since it resulted in increased warfare and ethnic tensions in Southeast Asia. Nicholas II of Russia, his wife, and 5 children were brutally slain in a basement. The Russian Revolution began in 1917 when soldiers, peasants, and workers were sick and tired of fighting in what seemed like a never-ending, pointless war. The imperial dynasty came to an end as a result of the revolution. As a result, the Romanov family, led by Tsar Nicholas II, was abruptly removed from power. Nicholas and his close-knit clan, including a wife he deeply loved and their 5 children, were banished to Ekaterinburg, Russia. There they were imprisoned in Ipatiev House, known as the House of Special Purpose. Unfortunately, the best kind of Tsar to the Bolsheviks was a dead one. In the early morning hours of July 17, 1918, the family was summoned from their beds and told they would need to flee the house. They were shepherded down to a basement room. Minutes later, a firing squad piled into the room, and a death sentence for the imperial family was read out. The gunfire began immediately and lasted for around 20 minutes. By the end of the first round, only Nicholas and Alexandra were dead. Their children lay breathing and bleeding on the floor. They had unwittingly crafted their own bulletproof vests by sewing jewels into their clothing so that they could carry some wealth with them when they fled the house. Since the bullets ricocheted off the children, the executioners resorted to bayoneting them to death. The murder of the Romanovs heralded the end of Imperial Russia and the beginning of the Soviet regime. It was one of the bloodiest political acts of the 20th century. Lord Darnley was so unpopular that he was murdered. Born an English nobleman, Lord Darnley married royalty in 1565 when he took Mary, Queen of Scotland, as his bride. Though Mary was initially smitten with the handsome nobleman, his true colors quickly showed, and his vain, shallow, and drunken ways soon made him unpopular at the Scottish court. His aggressive quest for greater power within the court did him no favors either. So, on February 9, 1567, he was found dead, the victim of an apparent murder. Even though Darnley was missed by everyone, many used his death as evidence against the Scottish Queen, who was also unpopular. Some suspected that Mary and her friend the Earl of Bothwell, whom some claimed was her lover, were the masterminds behind Darnley's demise. The antagonism towards Mary only increased in subsequent months. In July 1567, she would abdicate the throne and live out the rest of her life in exile in England until she herself would become the victim of political intrigue. Empress Elizabeth of Austria had the worst vacation ever. Recognized as one of the most beautiful women in Europe, Empress Elizabeth of Austria always attracted attention wherever she went. She was a romantic introvert who was married to Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I, and was uneasy with the strict court protocol. Sisi, as she was called, was more at home in the simple hills of Hungary than the mirrored halls of the royal palace. Her marriage with Franz Joseph was not a particularly good one, and she often spent time away from Vienna. In 1898, roughly 9 years after her son Rudolf took his life, she was vacationing in Geneva, Switzerland. Though she typically traveled incognito, word quickly spread throughout Geneva that the beautiful Sisi was in town. A young anarchist approached Sisi on September 10, 1898, as she was getting ready to board a ship, and he stabbed her with a small file. It was enough to do damage. Though Sisi initially did not know what happened, her condition rapidly deteriorated, and she perished. Sisi's death was yet another devastating blow to the aging emperor, and to a Europe that was beginning to look like a powder keg. Europe was shaken by royal assassinations in the latter part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, which made it clear that the political foundations on which the continent had been built were becoming increasingly unstable. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed 19 times in Florence's Duomo. True, the Medici family of Florence was not royalty in the traditional sense. They were the classic upstarts, a banking dynasty that amassed political power and married their way into prominent royal houses across Europe. Giuliano de' Medici was the co-ruler of Florence with his brother, Lorenzo, in all but name. Under their patronage, the arts of Florence flourished. But all that came to an end on April 26, 1478. Members of the rival Pazzi family attempted to mount a coup against the Medicis. So, Francesco de' Pazzi attacked the Medici brothers in the Duomo. Though Lorenzo escaped, Giuliano was stabbed at least 19 times on the floor of the cathedral before a crowd of thousands. Vengeance was swift and absolute. The assassins were executed. Lorenzo regained control of Florence, and Medici power only grew. Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times in the Roman Senate. Julius Caesar was not officially a king, but he was the closest thing Rome had to royalty in the 1st century BCE. In fact, political power passed through his family like a proper royal dynasty. Though he was a brilliant military tactician and politician, many among the Roman elite grew resentful of his increasing power, especially when he became dictator of Rome. Therefore, on March 15, 44 BCE, the infamous Ides of March, a group of approximately Roman senators stabbed Caesar 23 times with daggers. The death of Caesar was a dramatic moment in Roman history. It initiated a period of warfare, as rivals jockeyed to fill the power vacuum Caesar left behind. His adopted son, Octavian, would be victorious, ruling as Caesar Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Maximilian of Mexico was gunned down after a short reign. Maximilian was a member of the famous House of Habsburg. But as the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Maximilian never expected to rule anywhere in Europe. As a result, he agreed to be the new Emperor of Mexico, effectively a French puppet in North America. The 31-year-old emperor arrived in Mexico City in 1864 eager to be a good ruler. He passionately took up progressive causes. But Maximilian did not entirely win over the Mexican people. In 1867, Republican forces overthrew him, and he was assassinated on June 19, 1867. Maximilian's assassination paved the way for Benito Juárez to return to power as Mexico's president, a man who modernized Mexico and is celebrated as a hero. Louis I, Duke of Orleans, was hacked to death in the streets. Louis I, Duke of Orleans, was the younger brother of Charles VI of France, aka Charles the Mad. As the nickname suggests, Charles was an unstable monarch who suffered from bouts of mental illness. As Charles became increasingly unstable, it became abundantly clear that a regency would be necessary. Though Louis saw himself as a leader on the council, his nephew, the Duke of Burgundy, made it unequivocally stated that he had royal ambitions of his own. Burgundy engineered a coup against his relative. On November 23, 1407, Louis was slain in the streets of Paris by a group of assassins. It was, by all accounts, a particularly gory scene, as Louis was hacked apart. The murder of Louis helped to assure the ascendancy of the House of Burgundy in European politics. Blanche II of Navarre may have been assassinated by her own father. Born to John of Aragon and Blanche I of Navarre in 1424, Blanche II was a legitimate heir to the throne of Navarre, a small kingdom that was nestled between modern France and Spain. Since her mother was by birth and right the Queen of Navarre, her children, not her husband, had rights over the throne of Navarre. But that didn't stop John of Aragon from lusting after Navarre. In 1461, after the passing of her brother, Blanche became Queen of Navarre, much to the frustration of her father and younger sister. After an unconsummated marriage that ended in divorce, Blanche too was virtually imprisoned by her father and sister, Eleanor. So, in 1464, Blanche died by poison while still imprisoned by her sister. Historians suggest that her father and sister were probably behind it. Blanche's death ultimately allowed her sister Eleanor to become Queen of Navarre, which in turn allowed her father even more power and control in the kingdom. The 12 most influential royal slayings in world history. History is chock full of bloody moments. Of those bloody moments, Assassinations are some of the most grimly fascinating, since they are usually the result of complicated plots, schemes, and conspiracies. Often, these events are historically important, as well, since assassinations that changed the world brought about chaos, fear, and change sometimes on a global scale. Executions have also played a significant role in altering the course of history. Royals have been the victims of more than a few bloody ends. True part of ruling is dying. After all, death is part of the royal life cycle. But many royals throughout history were ushered into death a little faster and less naturally than others. Since royals are living and breathing symbols of power and authority, one of the most significant and cold-blooded ways to challenge that power and authority is to straight-up kill them. Royal assassinations are always political. To assume power, it's sometimes necessary to get one's hands dirty and murder a royal. Since royals hold positions of massive importance locally and globally, their slayings are often political bombshells that have a multitude of repercussions. Some changed the course of history, ushered in periods of war, new regimes, and resistance movements. Others had no effect but to keep vulnerable societies on edge. Either way, they're as fascinating to discover as they are historically significant. One of the most consequential royal assassinations in modern history was the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His assassination in 1914 in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip ignited World War I, leading to a global conflict that reshaped national borders and empires. In a similar vein, in 1881, Alexander II of Russia, who was known for reforming the judiciary and emancipating serfs, was killed by anarchists. This tragedy made the Russian monarchy more reactionary and helped steer the country toward the revolution of 1917. Then there's King Charles I of England, whose beheading in 1649 after a bitter civil war signaled a shift toward parliamentary power in England, fundamentally altering the balance of governance. In Southeast Asia, Tabin Shweti, King of Burma, was murdered in 1550, with his death sparking power struggles and ethnic divisions that altered Burmese history. Russia's Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed in abasement during the Russian Revolution in 1918, brutally ending the Romanov dynasty and ushering in Bolshevik rule. Closer to the Renaissance courts, Lord Darnley, the ill-fated husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, was assassinated in 1567, casting suspicion on Mary and contributing to her downfall. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, was murdered by an anarchist in Geneva in 1898, reflecting the instability brewing in Europe at the time. Giuliano de' Medici, co-ruler of Florence, was killed by the Puzzi family in a dramatic coup attempt inside a cathedral in 1478, strengthening the Medici grip on power after a wave of executions. Julius Caesar, though not technically a monarch, was stabbed 23 times by Roman senators on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, a betrayal that led to civil war and the birth of the Roman Empire under Augustus. Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, installed by the French, was executed by Republican forces in 1867, marking the end of imperial ambitions in Mexico and the rise of Benito Juárez. Louis I, Duke of Orleans, was hacked to death in 1407 during a feud that triggered civil war in France between the Burgundians and Armagnacs. Finally, Blanche II of Navarre, a legitimate queen by birthright, was likely poisoned by her own father and sister in a gruesome power grab that shifted control of the small but strategic kingdom. These 12 royal slayings are not merely tales of betrayal and bloodlust. Each one, from Caesar's death in ancient Rome to Nicholas II's fall during Russia's Red Upheaval, left an unmistakable mark on history, altering governments, instigating wars, and redefining power. Their deaths serve as eerie reminders that the lives of royals, no matter how lavish or exalted, have always walked a fine line between throne and tomb. The 12 most influential royal slayings in world history. Throughout history, the murder of royalty has been one of the most dramatic and consequential forms of political violence. Unlike common assassinations, royal killings reverberate through nations, toppling dynasties, sparking wars, and reshaping entire civilizations. From Julius Caesar's bloody betrayal to the Romanov massacre, these regicides and political murders didn't just end lives, they altered the course of history. Below are 12 of the most influential royal slayings, each a turning point that sent shockwaves across empires and continents. 1. Julius Caesar, 44 BCE. The stabbing that ended the Roman Republic. Et tu, Brute. The last words, possibly apocryphal, of Rome's most famous dictator as his closest allies plunged 23 daggers into him on the Ides of March. Why it mattered. Caesar's death triggered a civil war, leading to the rise of Augustus and the birth of the Roman Empire. Legacy. The assassination became the ultimate symbol of political betrayal, inspiring everything from Shakespearean drama to modern coups. 2. The first monarch to be executed in public was King Charles I of England in 1649. After losing the English Civil War, Charles I was put on trial by Parliament and beheaded outside Whitehall Palace. Why it mattered. This was the first time a reigning king was legally executed by his own people, setting a precedent for constitutional monarchy. Legacy. The event paved the way for Oliver Cromwell's Republic, and later, the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. 3. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, 1914. The shot that started World War I. When 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip assassinated Austria-Hungary's heir in Sarajevo, it ignited a chain reaction of alliances that led to World War I. Why it mattered. The war destroyed empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, Russian, and redrew the map of Europe. Legacy. The Treaty of Versailles' harsh terms on Germany set the stage for World War II. 4. Tsar Nicholas II and the Romanovs, 1918. The Bolsheviks' brutal end to Imperial Russia. After the Russian Revolution, Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were gunned down and bayoneted in a basement by Bolshevik executioners. Why it mattered. The massacre ended 300 years of Romanov rule and solidified communist control. Legacy. The mystery of the Romanovs' fate fueled monarchist myths for decades, until their remains were discovered in 1991. 5. Giuliano de' Medici, 1478. The cathedral massacre that shaped Renaissance Florence. The Puzzi conspiracy saw Giuliano stabbed 19 times in Florence's Duomo, while his brother Lorenzo barely escaped. Why it mattered. The Medici tightened their grip on Florence, leading to a golden age of Renaissance art and power. Legacy. The assassination inspired Machiavelli's writings on political ruthlessness. 6. Lord Darnley, 1567. The murder that doomed Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's unpopular husband, Lord Darnley, was strangled and blown up in a plot many believe she orchestrated. Why it mattered. Mary's abdication as a result of the scandal was followed by her execution by Elizabeth I of England. Legacy. England's path to Protestant dominance was secured, while Scotland fell under English influence. 7. Alexander II of Russia's bombing that brought an end to reform in 1881, known as the Tsar Liberator, for freeing the serfs. Alexander II was blown apart by anarchist bombs in St. Petersburg. Why it mattered. His successors, Alexander III, Nicholas II, reversed reforms, fueling revolutionary anger. Legacy. The assassination foreshadowed the Russian Revolution of 1917. 8. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, 1898. The stabbing that shook Europe. Sisi, the beloved but melancholic empress, was stabbed with a file by an anarchist in Geneva. Why it mattered. Her death deepened the despair of Emperor Franz Joseph, whose heir's suicide, Rudolf, and nephew's assassination, Franz Ferdinand, led to World War I. Legacy. The Habsburg dynasty collapsed in 1918 and never recovered. 9. Maximilian I of Mexico, 1867. The puppet emperor's firing squad. Installed by Napoleon III, Maximilian was abandoned by France and executed by Mexican Republicans. Why it mattered. His death solidified Benito Juárez's rule and Mexico's independence from European meddling. Legacy. A cautionary tale about foreign-backed monarchies failing in the Americas.